the leading, action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by the International Telecommunication Union, the United Nations Agency for Digital Technologies, in partnership with 50+ UN sister organizations and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to unlock AI's potential to serve humanity. In today's AI for Good event, we are counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished facilitators and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
So welcome again to the AI for Good, AI for Climate sessions. And my name is Philip Steele, and I'm super excited to have today with me Maria Molina, who will be today's speaker. So Maria has a master's in climate and society from Columbia, did a PhD at Central Michigan University, went on to NCAR, where she was first an ASB fellow and then a scientist, and now is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland, where she leads a group on data science for climate and extremes, which is perfect for the topic because that's, I think, what you're exactly going to speak about. So I'll just hand over straight to you, Maria. And for all attendees, feel free to put questions in the chat at any time. We'll try to pick them all up in the end. Over to you, Maria.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Philip. And hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here with you today. I'll go ahead and share my slides now and put them in presenter mode. Perfect. And so today I'll be talking to you about learning without labels. So really thinking about using unsupervised learning techniques to get new insights into the climate system and also extreme events. And these extreme events can include things like extreme heat waves or basically any large anomaly from our base climate state. And I wanted to share an image of my research group. I'm very lucky to get to work with a group of PhD students that are all very bright and creative and keep me on my toes. And a lot of the work that I'll be sharing throughout this presentation has been led by them or done in collaboration with them. And so just again, to highlight that this work is not done just by me, but really a team effort. And so I'll be talking about a couple of items. So I wanted to give you an overview of what we'll be going through today. So the first thing I'll go through is just provide a general overview of some methods and some of the basic foundations that we need for the use of AI in weather and climate modeling. And then I'll provide a few examples of unsupervised learning applications, ways that we've been using unsupervised learning in my research group. And then I'll also provide some examples of what's on the horizon for my group in the AI for weather and climate modeling space, including some techniques using unsupervised learning on the horizon. But when we think about traditional numerical weather prediction or climate modeling, we can sort of bin that process into three different stages. We have the input stage, the running the model stage, and the output stage, where in the input stage, we can essentially create a representation of the initial state of the Earth system. The closer that initial state is to the actual state, the better will be in terms of predictability or prediction skill, especially at short time scales. At the weather time scales, we really need a very accurate initial state. So that means 7 days to 10 days or so out from time zero. During the running the model stage, we typically rely on high performance computing, especially when we're doing this at higher spatial resolutions and also globally. And there's also always going to be the need for some subgrid scale physical parameterization schemes to represent processes that we cannot explicitly resolve and compute at the grid scale level. Things like cloud microphysics and other small scale processes. And then at the output stage, once we've run the physics-based model out to the lead time that we're interested in, whether that's a climate timescale or a weather timescale, we can then do things with that output. We can either translate that information to stakeholders so that they can make appropriate decisions that they need to make with that information, or we as scientists can also ask additional questions with that data. And then when we're thinking about the use of AI and machine learning in this three-stage framework, we can actually fit machine learning into these different stages. So for instance, when we're creating that initial state before we even run the physics-based model, we can use machine learning for a series of tasks. These things include like data assimilation. So again, trying to create a more skillful representation of that initial state so that we start off as close as possible to what actually is happening. It can also entail parameter estimation, so determining which of those physics parameterizations that are in the running the model stage are going to constrain uncertainty based on what we are interested in modeling. Also gap filling, data fusion, and even things like sensor placement. So determining where we should be placing weather stations or other such sensors in space in the future to reduce any error in prediction is something that we can do with techniques like active learning. Then finally, at the running the model stage, machine learning can be used for a number of things, including the task of detecting features online while the model is running, as opposed to waiting until you get all the output at the end, which can be quite expensive. And we can also use machine learning to create more skillful subgrid parameterization schemes that hopefully reduce model error as the model's running forward in time. And then at the output stage, we can use machine learning for things like information extraction, so not only feature detection, but also asking questions of the Earth system, as you'll see today. We can also do things like downscaling or offline bias correction and so forth. So again, there's a broad range of applications for machine learning throughout the entire workflow of weather and climate modeling. And of course, what you've likely heard of a lot in the news is the use of AI and machine learning to completely bypass the traditional three-stage framework for climate and weather modeling, where we can actually start with an input, use machine learning then to either auto-regressively model forward in time. Auto-regressively meaning we put in an input into a machine learning model, it gives us some output at a future time, and we can take that output and use it as the input again to generate a new output. And we can do that auto-regressively, or simply going straight from an input to the lead time of interest at some future time. Like for example, starting from an input today and then predicting something 2 years into the future. So there's a range of ways that we can do this input to output stage modeling purely with AI. But the point being that we can completely bypass that three-stage framework as well. And there's a number of advantages to working within those three stages or completely bypassing, depending on the question at hand and what the group is interested in. But when we are thinking about how much data we have, that's going to be a really relevant question for what method we can use and what question we can answer, right? So when we have a lot of data, that empowers us to use more complex methods like deep neural networks. And then when we have more limited data available, that empowers us to use things like symbolic regression, or AKA equation discovery, or techniques that are more, that enable more limited use of data and still don't don't end up overfitting, right? So there are actually techniques that benefit from fewer data samples as opposed to more data samples. And so an important consideration is that how much data do we have available, because that will help us determine what methods we can actually use. And I will say a nice thing about unsupervised learning is that we can more easily work in a more data limited or moderate data regime where we don't necessarily need a lot of data. But of course, that depends on the question that we are asking, as you will see. And then if we do have a lot of data in a certain application, but maybe much more limited data in a different application, something we can do is train a neural network in a regime where we have a lot of data, and then apply techniques like meta learning or transfer learning to move into a more data limited space. So for instance, we can train a neural network with a lot of data and then take that pre-trained neural network and continue training with a model that perhaps has more limited data output or observational data that's more limited. And so now I'll be going through unsupervised learning applications, and there's quite a few different types of applications that I'll be describing. But when we're thinking about unsupervised learning, we're essentially talking about data that doesn't have a predefined answer, if you will. So for example, when we think of linear regression, we have y equals mx plus b. In this case, you wouldn't know what y is. So you don't have a predicand. You just have data, and you are interested in looking at patterns that repeat within that data, or even potentially patterns that do not repeat and are anomalies within that data. And that empowers us to use a technique like anomaly detection. But again, I'll be going through a few unsupervised learning applications here, and to hopefully inspire you to potentially use these techniques for your own science. And so the first project I'll be sharing is a project that I got to work on with Alice Duvivier, who is a scientist at NSF NCAR. And essentially, she was interested in identifying Antarctic polynyas. Antarctic polynyas are these areas of exposed sea ice in the Antarctic, right, off coastal areas. And they're really important for biological reasons, right? So animals can feed in that area. And they're also associated with deep water formation. And these are topics that I myself am not an expert on. I'm not a polar scientist, although I do have a climate background. But Alice Duvivier is a polar scientist and essentially very interested in these patterns. And so she came to me with a problem, which is that current methods or previous methods to detect polynyas were very rigid. And so she wanted a more flexible method that could automatically detect these features without labels, right? So without predefining what a polynya is. And so we ended up using self-organizing maps, which are these neural networks that essentially separate patterns onto a smooth topological surface. And we used sea ice concentration to train this neural network. And we just gave it patterns of sea ice concentration. And what it did was it ended up creating a topological surface and separating these polynya patterns in the Antarctic. And this is over, I believe, the Ross Sea. And that in itself is nice, right? But essentially all we're doing is grouping patterns. Something then more interesting that we can do once we have separated these patterns with unsupervised learning is then look at other characteristics within those categories. And what was really cool was that when we looked at trends of those individual groups of sea ice patterns, we suddenly saw a very sharp decline in one of the patterns and a very sharp increase in the occurrence of another one of these patterns. And I should have mentioned that this was using the Community Earth System model, large ensemble. So this is a climate model with future climate projections. So you can see the year going out to 2060 and beyond. And again, the self-organizing map was only given sea ice concentration patterns. It was not told anything about dates. But when we looked at the dates that these events occurred in within the model, we noticed that the pattern associated with large polynyas was going to be decreasing, which is of course problematic for animals that rely on them and deep water formation. And the pattern that was associated with less or reduced polynya occurrence was going to be increasing in that region in Antarctica. So this is a really straightforward example of how we can take phenomena that we're interested in. We want to separate patterns based on some variable that's really important for characterizing that phenomena. And then we can look at additional properties of that phenomena. And in this case, a very stark or dramatic story emerged when we look at trends. We can then use perhaps more complicated unsupervised learning techniques to look at other properties of the Earth system. And so in this example, I have Emily Wazinski, who's currently a PhD student at the University of Maryland, and she was interested in analyzing ENSO's diversity, right? So ENSO is the El Niño Southern Oscillation in the tropical Pacific, and we can characterize it using a number of techniques, but one of the most popular ways is by looking at sea surface temperatures in the equatorial Pacific. And positive anomalies are associated with El Niño, and negative anomalies are associated with La Niña. And so she was interested in analyzing ENSO diversity, but looking at it through a more holistic lens, where instead of just considering sea surface temperatures, we can consider subsurface conditions, in this case, using oceanic heat content, and also atmospheric conditions. So thinking of the Walker cell, and she used outgoing long wave radiation for that. And so she fed in 3 different variables into a multivariate autoencoder, which has essentially separate encoders that take in this data, and then they're all connected in a latent space or a bottleneck, if you will. And then there are 3 decoders that are also separate and reconstruct those respective variables. So they all connect in this shared latent space. And what's neat about this technique is that she ended up using a variational autoencoder, which not only creates a bottleneck, but also enforces continuity and applies a Gaussian distribution using this KL divergence term, where we can model the mu and sigma of this latent space. And what's nice about that is that we move from a traditional input-output stage to actually a space where we now have a distribution instead, and we're modeling the underlying distribution. And that's what distinguishes generative methods from traditional machine learning methods. And so in this case, she's now able to sample within this latent space different El Niño events and characterize ENSO diversity. And in this case, I'll also note that for her application, she's using a beta variational autoencoder, which essentially, for her case, downweights the importance of a Gaussian distribution that is applied, and that's to allow more skillful reconstruction of those fields. But this method is unsupervised because the reconstructions are just the inputs themselves. So whatever data you have, you can use as input and as your label, even though it's not any different than the input. And so with that, she trained this beta variational autoencoder using 3 different variables. And she had a latent space that was still pretty complex. So to be able to visualize this 20-dimensional latent space, she applied a self-organizing map. And what she uncovered was that there were different flavors of El Niño within that latent space. And this is ongoing analysis, but I will share initial takeaways are that it does appear there is a continuum of El Niño flavors, and these have very distinct thermocline properties in addition to associated atmospheric response. No surprise. But essentially, again, just showing how different types of unsupervised learning can be leveraged to characterize properties of the Earth system. Kyle Hall is another PhD student in my group who was also inspired by autoencoders. And we decided to ask a question that has been asked many times in the climate community, which is whether El Nino and the Pacific decadal oscillation are meaningfully different. So there is the hypothesis that decadal variability in the Pacific is simply like a statistical artifact of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which varies on shorter timescales, on interannual timescales. And so we said, what if we could train an autoencoder to disentangle modes of climate variability that are meaningfully occur or recur? And so what he did was he ended up taking an autoencoder, but created a custom loss function with 5 different terms in the loss function. 2 of those terms focus on spectral decomposition and also on centering these nodes within the first layer of the decoder and also within the latent space. And so essentially the main goal was to separate modes of climate variability based on spectral signals or properties and allow for some overlap, since we acknowledge that in the Earth system, there's going to be modes of climate variability with some wiggle room and some overlapping timescales. And the autoencoder was able to separate or disentangle these different modes of climate variability flexibly on its own without us prescribing those different timescales. And what's interesting is that something that emerged as important or meaningful mode of climate variability from this autoencoder was a quasi-biennial timescale, which one could argue is simply another type of or another representation of the El Nino Southern Oscillation on shorter timescales. But nonetheless, we left it as a separate mode of climate variability as the autoencoder through this technique identified it as such. But a powerful thing that we can then do with these trained latent spaces in autoencoders is that we can sweep the latent space to generate synthetic events and sort of fill the gap or the observational gap, if you will. So in this example, I'm showing Kyle Hall's animation from his knowledge-guided autoencoder, where he's sweeping the latent space here on the, hopefully you can see my cursor, but on the bottom right, we have on the x-axis interannual mode, on the y-axis the decadal mode, and you see the red dot that's circling is essentially sampling across this intersection of the 2 modes of climate variability. And where we don't have any dots, that is where we simply did not have any samples to train with. And despite not having any samples to train with, we can still extrapolate out there. Now, of course, we don't have any data to evaluate the realism of that extrapolation, but nonetheless, we can still do that. And if you were to look at the smattering of dots, that we're simply kind of filling the gap there. This image that you're seeing is essentially the spatial reconstruction of that sampling technique. And on the this black line that you're seeing dancing up and down is showing the I believe this is the x-axis is longitude, and so you're seeing like the anomaly temperature along that axis. So you can see rising, warming, and then cooling associated with La Nina. But now I wanted to go a little bit more in depth into a different unsupervised learning application. So in this case, we were interested in benchmarking a physics-based initialized prediction system where we focus on subseasonal timescales. But I do want to note that although this is subseasonal, so meaning we go out to 3 to 4 weeks into the future from time 0, this would be true of any time scale, right? So here you could pick your lead time of interest for this benchmarking exercise. But in this case, we were interested in prediction at 3 to 4 weeks into the future because it's a really difficult time to predict out to. We have a real limited set of sources of predictability. We lose predictability from the initial state, and our predictability from the boundary conditions hasn't really kicked in. And what we know is that usually by that time, the model will have deviated quite a bit from what actually happened. So our observations that we would use to benchmark, and that would be partly due to model errors as the model is running, or partly due to initial condition errors as a result of not having a perfect representation of the initial state. And so something we can do is we can sample within the initial state to generate a number of different trajectories out to lead time of interest. And essentially that PDF or probability density function, or the distribution of possible outcomes at a lead time of interest would be what we would be interested in. So the wider the PDF, then the more uncertain you would be of the prediction. And the more constrained it is, the more confident you can be of that prediction. But essentially what we know is that with subseasonal prediction, we generally have much greater skill for temperature at weeks 3, 4 compared to precipitation. So here you're looking at different iterations of the CESM versions 1 and 2, different configurations and different numbers of ensemble members for skill of winter land prediction globally for these two variables. And the anomaly correlation coefficient essentially means that the higher the value is, the more skillful. You can see skill decreasing as lead time increases, as would be expected. But the skill anomaly correlation coefficient at weeks 3, 4 for temperature is 0.3. And for precipitation at the same lead time is just 0.1. So it's much lower for precipitation. And so because precipitation is so hard to predict, we wanted to sort of simplify the problem, right? So we were instead interested in looking at weather regimes, which are these large-scale atmospheric patterns, and we focus on North America. And so in this case, we're using the CESM2 subseasonal prediction system, and these follow the sub-X protocol. And so these weather regimes were trained using k-means clustering, so a very traditional and well-established unsupervised learning method where we initialize a number of different centroids, and then we fit these geopotential height patterns. These are at 500 hectopascal over North America within this black polygon, if you will, or black box. And then we extract these recurrent patterns, and these have been pre-processed in a way that they are very smooth, so they are focused on the subseasonal timescale. But what's interesting is that we can fit these clusters using a reanalysis product, right? So we're working in an unsupervised learning regime with reanalysis. We uncover these recurring patterns, and then we can apply the centroids that were trained using ERA 5 to a different data set. In this case, we apply them to CESM2 initialized prediction system. And we want to do that because we know that these recurrent patterns are associated with surface conditions. So they have a surface anomaly imprint where, for example, the Alaskan Ridge has positive precipitation anomalies over places like California and dry anomalies over the Gulf Coast and British Columbia. And so, yeah, so we know there are associated temperature and precipitation patterns, and hopefully we can extract more skill at the subseasonal lead time space than we would otherwise without weather regimes. And so here what we're doing is we're asking, how well does CESM2 initialized prediction system perform compared to reanalysis on the classification of weather regimes? And so we can see that at day 0, the error 5 and CESM are very similar. And then as you increase in lead time, we see a deviation where CESM2 now has a number of biases emerging, particularly with an overoccurrence of the West Coast High and an underoccurrence of the Greenland High and Alaskan Ridge regime. So we know that there is a lack of or a limit to predictability when it comes to Greenland High and Alaskan Ridge regimes over North America. And there's going to be more false positives, if you will, for the West Coast High. And another thing that emerged was that we can also look at this within the ensemble space. And something that emerged was that instead of seeing our distribution increase during later lead times, we saw a decrease occur during certain times. And so we took a look at certain case studies of this. So one of these is the November 9th, 2015 initialization with CESM. And essentially, to understand this figure on the left-hand side, what you could do is just focus on the circle and X when there's the same color. That means CESM got the prediction for the weather regime correct. And when they're a different color, CESM got it wrong. And on the y-axis, we have how many ensemble members agreed on that prediction. And so during early lead times, of course, the forecast is right. They're both the same color, and a lot of ensemble members are agreeing. Then as you increase in lead time, we have an incorrect forecast and fewer ensemble members agreeing. And then by lead time of 25 to 30 days into the future, suddenly more ensemble members are agreeing on the forecast, and the CESM prediction system got it right. And so essentially we were like, what's going on with this ensemble realignment where ensemble members are agreeing on the forecast, and we're also seeing this increase in skill. And so when we looked at a number of different upstream conditions, something that we noted was that this was related likely to the Madden-Julian oscillation, because outgoing long-wave radiation skill also increased across the North Pacific during the same lead time, and it looked like that was propagating from the Indian Pacific Ocean. So that was a nice thing to see, that we can attribute this ensemble realignment to specific upstream conditions, and that skill isn't sort of spatially stationary, right? It's kind of propagating and can realign these ensemble members to be more skillful when the region of interest is fixed within a certain domain. Of course, ensemble realignments can also be wrong, meaning you can get ensemble members agreeing on something and that prediction be wrong. So user beware on ensemble realignment. But for weather regimes, we can also use them as now for self-supervised or semi-supervised type applications. So for instance, in this case, we use unsupervised learning to define weather regimes. And then Jairon, who's a PhD candidate in my group, went ahead and designed an experiment where he asked, for subseasonal prediction, we know that the atmosphere is really important at early lead times, and land and the ocean become more important at later lead times. And so he said, what if I can ask that question for weather regimes using machine learning, which would be much more cheap to run computationally as opposed to an actual numerical prediction system. And so here he's giving an example of using sea surface temperature as an input. He has XGBoost models that are each trained with individual input variables from different components of the Earth system, and then they're tasked with predicting which weather regime would be occurring from lead times of 1 week in the future to 8 weeks into the future. And then he looked at which were the best performing models, and essentially was able to show that the atmosphere, of course, is the most important contributor to skill during early lead times. But as we get into later lead times, we start to see land and the ocean emerge as very important. And some of these are associated with surface temperature or soil water content. And also for the ocean, very importantly, subsurface conditions as opposed to sea surface conditions. So all of these OHC are ocean heat content integrated down to different levels. They were the most important contributors across a range of lead times. And here we're showing the best model for each component across all years. But within the paper, something that was more surprising was seeing how much this schematic would vary depending on the season. So some seasons you see land emerge as a very important contributor, and during other seasons you see other components like the ocean emerge as much more important. And for the XGBoost experiment, he also noted that predictability was much greater during winter and fall, which is no surprise. For weather regimes, we of course have stronger teleconnection patterns and so forth during the cool season than during the warm season. But within this unsupervised learning regime, for the last example, it was a combination of supervised and unsupervised. But using unsupervised learning, Gyron was also able to uncover a meaningful trend in the Pacific Trough over North America, where it turns out that if we look at observational trends and trends within the model, there is a disagreement in that projection in the Pacific Trough occurrence, where one claims an increase and the other claims a decrease. So similar to the pattern effect issue over the Pacific, where we have La Nina observed, but El Nino projected, I believe. Hopefully I didn't flip those, but in the case of Pacific Trough, we similarly have disagreement between reanalysis trends and what is projected to occur. And some of that might be associated with aerosols. But in the case of Gyron's study, what we noted was a disagreement, but overall a projected increase eventually in the Pacific Trough within models and an observed increase within reanalysis. And this is meaningful because it is associated with surface conditions that include not only extremely hot days during winter and spring, so hot being relative, but also with increased wildfire occurrence as well, likely associated with not only heat, but also drier conditions. So these unsupervised learning patterns that can be extracted can also be linked to additional variables, or the analysis themselves can also be made multivariate to begin with. And I think the last example I'll give you for an unsupervised learning application, also focused on regimes, was led by an undergraduate student who graduated and is now working at NOAA full-time, Luke. Luke ended up being interested in uncovering recurrent pathways between regimes. So for instance, if you were in a Pacific Trough regime, which regime would be most likely to come next, right? And hopefully because that would give us an idea into predictability. But for his case, we also sort of kind of got a little bit more into the analysis of regimes and noted that individual regimes can vary quite a lot, right? So for instance, if we take a Pacific Trough regime and we take individual events within that general class, we can see that they can vary overall quite a bit. And so for pathways, another thing that we noted was that if we were to use a technique like self-organizing maps, those generally rely on a rectangular lattice, like you see here on the far left, where each individual node or type of event would be limited to only 2 transitions. And that would limit our ability to study all the different possible pathways. And so we ended up being inspired by the existence of a hexagonal topology where instead of a node being represented by 4 connections, a node could be represented by 6 connections to neighboring nodes. But a limitation with this approach is that if you take a look at the corners, some corners have only 2 pathways possible, and some corners have 3 pathways possible. So we thought this ended up biasing our analysis, and we did see this when we would train with this middle type, where these corners would end up kind of getting stuck and being much more persistent. And so we thought that was not good for our pathway analysis. So Luke ended up modifying the Minisom algorithm that he was using from, this is a Python library or repository that you can find on GitHub, again called Minisom for self-organizing maps. And what he did was he ended up creating a hexagon lattice to accompany the hexagonal topology. And so this limited this bias or removed this bias. And so now we can have a smoother transition space between our events. Now, we still ended up getting corner groupings, but at least now we can see that some corners end up with fewer groupings, if you will, than we did before. So it did resolve the bias a bit, but not perfectly. But overall, we were able to not only train this hexagonal lattice and topology for weather regimes, but then we were also able to see how events transitioned among themselves and characterize the diversity of individual weather regimes, where we can see that different weather regimes have more different sort of representations, if you will, based on where we are in time. And so, for example, if we were to look at this in terms of pie charts, we could see that the top left corner had more events of polar high, but there were still some representation of Atlantic Ridge within that class of regime, and other types of regimes had expressions of Pacific Trough and Pacific Ridge within them, depending on the exact setup of the large-scale circulation. But lastly, for Luke's analysis, he was then able to characterize different transitions and found dominant transitions between different types of regimes or subcategories of regimes, and also meaningful seasonal expressions of those pathways. And so this paper is currently under review, but there is a preprint. I see it says to be submitted. This is actually already under review and publicly available. But again, with that, I'll go ahead and quickly wrap up with what's on the horizon for the group. So we do have the development of AI-ready data sets to sort of facilitate this training of unsupervised learning methods and supervised learning methods for those that are interested. So Jonathan Starfelt, who's a PhD student in my group and currently at AGU in New Orleans presenting on this work, he's created an AI-ready data set that focuses on harmonizing a number of different geostationary and polar orbiting satellite products to accelerate the understanding and characterization of urban heat. And this focuses on a number of cities across the Western Hemisphere, and it's a NASA-funded project. Jairon is continuing on to his last PhD project and is also at AGU presenting on this work, where he is taking weather regimes and looking at their causal origins using a spatial causality algorithm called CASTLE that is published now in James, led by Jake Nickel. And essentially, he's able to currently backtrack where these causal contributions come from different components of the Earth system. So it's pretty exciting work. And then lastly, Dean Calhoun, another PhD student in my group, is working on bringing in humans into this AI modeling space, where we can ask who is impacted and whether there are any inequities in who is skillfully getting forecasts or getting skillful forecasts from AI-based models. And essentially, he's working towards also multimodal contextualization of AI-based information for weather and climate. And so with that, I will, I guess the last thing, something to note, it's important that we all continue to, inform ourselves and learn and stay up to date on the application of AI in general, but also specific to geoscience. And so we recently published a paper in BAMS that focused on the use of AI in the classroom and also in research. And we found some really subtle errors in the use of ChatGPT and some of its associated responses. This was GPT-4, so it's been a little bit. Of course, we now have 5, but some of the errors can be so subtle. And so really, it's important to bring in our domain expertise and look at these tools and use them very carefully, right? They empower us to do a lot of things much more quickly and open opportunities for us humans. But we also need to make sure that we're working with the AI and improving the AI as well. Or at least editing the AI so that we can make sure that information that we share is still accurate. And of course, anything that is generated from any AI tool is going to be subject to the data that it's seen. And so in this case, we have an image that was created from a DALL-E model version 3, where we ask, can you create an illustration of a meteorologist at work? And there may be a number of biases that you could see emerge in that image. But with that, I will stop talking. And thank you so much for your attention. And I welcome any questions or any thoughts.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Maria. Really interesting. Yes. Obviously, meteorologists can only be white males standing in front of.
Yeah, or lots of funding there for the the screens.
But obviously, you're the living counterexample here. So it's perfect. Just to invite people, feel free to put questions in the chat at any time. But I'll kick us off with some questions. So it was super interesting. I had a question about this weather regimes and the prediction sort of on different lead times, how your skill change from the different components. I wasn't entirely sure I fully got this. So you nicely showed sort of it initially at short lead times, the atmosphere gives you a lot of skill, and then you switch more to the ocean and the land later. I can see that the ocean sort of is quite independent of the atmosphere because of timescales are so different. But I wonder if the good skill of land in this approach wouldn't also require the atmosphere to have been correct, because the land probably is quite heavily influenced by soil moisture and precipitation and other things. Is it the wrong way to think about it, or?
No, that's a great thought. Yeah, I hadn't quite thought about it that way. I guess it depends on who you ask, right? I'm not a land modeling expert, and I assume land modeling experts might have a much more strong reaction to your comments. But I mean, I guess we can think of there's going to be soil moisture, different soil properties. So even if you got the atmosphere right, not all land surfaces are going to respond or having the same amount of memory, if you will, I would guess. So that might be important. And then, of course, if you had a certain amount of snowpack, then sure, it depended on snow being properly modeled over the winter, but eventually there's also the melting of that snow and proper representation of that snow cover. And I guess I'm trying to think of tributaries and rivers and groundwater, which is also really important to have properly represented. I don't know how well that's represented in reanalyses or in climate models. I'm sure that varies greatly, but assuming that it's represented sufficiently, then that would be a different source of predictability, I would think. Sure, each component is totally not independent. I mean, I would I would venture to say the atmosphere is also going to imprint on the ocean somewhat.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, right. So it's not, you can't really totally decouple each component from each other. It is in our system after all. But yeah, but there should be some processes that may have stronger contributions, if you will.
Yeah. Timescales will probably matter. I mean, I'll pull us back a little bit to the AI stuff later, but I can't help myself asking also as an aerosol scientist. You mentioned potential sort of weather pattern trends and links to aerosols. Do you have a working hypothesis? What might be coming in there?
Oh, yeah. So we wanted to include the aerosol analysis in this paper. It's now available in Earth's Future. I probably didn't update the citation. I may have said it was under review or something, but it's now publicly available. And we had a whole section about aerosols on and working hypotheses, and then we removed them because of potential issues in data and their representation. But I would say Jairon at this point, my PhD candidate, is more suited to answer questions on this topic. But he had some working hypotheses after a literature review of its influence. I mean, you have direct and indirect aerosol effects and different heating contributions, I guess, that could influence weather regimes. But yeah, I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you.
Yeah, well, nobody really has at this point, so that's why I'm asking.
He did remove it, so it was
Okay.
speculative.
Okay, fair enough.
But yeah, I think it's something he wants to come back to, and yeah, and the PhD candidate has become the master. I am no longer the expert. He's taken his topic and run with it. So
that's what should happen. Brilliant. Maybe going a bit more to the methods part also. I mean, you showed this really nice sort of bit where you sort of scanned your latent space and how you also use this to sort of extrapolate in latent space. It obviously makes you a bit nervous because we don't know really what's in there in that part of the latent space. And do you have any sense or ideas how you can test maybe physical consistencies or so? Are these actually, do you expect these to be physically plausible realizations, or can it just be junk?
yeah. I mean, it could be hallucinations, it could be junk, and or it could be physically meaningful. So I know that with Emily Wazinski, with her work, given that it's a generative approach, and so we have a distribution, we're hoping that we can sample within that distribution. And so some of the things we want to do is look at like physical realism of these fields, right? So not only generate the one single field within the input space, but also generate the full reconstruction and see what these look like and see if they're physically meaningful. But ultimately, we will never really know, right? We can assess if they satisfy a number of different criteria for physical realism. Right. So if you're, for example, looking at a tropical cyclone, we can assess its warm core structure and a number of other diagnostics. But yeah, I don't know.
Potentially one could think of withholding some sort of parts to create artificial gaps and see if you fill it in correctly. I'm just thinking out loud.
That's right. Yeah, you could, but then even then you might argue against that. But I like that approach. We'll have to tap you when we get to that part.
Would be at least a sort of give some sanity check if it's just making up stuff. That could be kind of fun to play.
Yeah, and I guess one thing I do want to add is like, even if we are able to find that certain parts of the latent space can be interpolated and be physically meaningful, how do we know when there's going to be a point where we've sampled a space that maybe is not plausible, right? And so at that point, I think having some sort of confidence measure for that would also be important. I assume it's not going to be, yes, it's physically realistic. No, it's not. There's probably going to be in between in there as well. So
yes,
yeah.
We're not done just yet, which is good. Maybe asking for a friend, because it's quite a thing that people in the audience may also wonder about. So from your experience, you worked with quite a bit of different unsupervised machine learning architectures. What guides the choice of those? Is it trial and error, or do you have any words of wisdom to share from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a few different approaches. I think I didn't mention I presented examples for the autoencoder being more for like asking questions or exploration, but they can also be used for anomaly detection. So this is another project we're working on where we're asking where we're trying to detect which spatial evolutions or spatial evolutions of heat waves are actually very unusual, if you will, in a much more flexible way than simply like some percent deviation from a climatology. And so you can use them for anomaly detection. So ultimately, I would start with the question at hand, and
Yeah.
then and I think I have a decision tree somewhere for overall AI ML decision on what model to use or technique to use, but I don't have a breakdown for unsupervised. But I would guess anomaly detection would be in one category, dimensionality reduction, like if you were trying to do a PCA type approach, whether it's linear or nonlinear method would be another branch of that tree. And then for clustering, I would keep self-organizing maps and k-means type clustering techniques as separate, where one would be how important is it for you to have a smooth topological space between events as well, versus simply separating groups as far as possible, because that would allow you to ask different types of questions that it will depend on whether or not you're interested in them. So yeah, it starts with the question ultimately, and I would say that's true of even supervised learning, right? How we design these systems starts with the question and the data.
Yeah, no, good point. I see my colleague, actually, Miles Allen, who's probably just down the corridor, actually pulls us back to the El Nino, and he's basically asking about the missing quadrant in the interannual sort of decadal components of the El Nino. I mean, you sort of said it could be extrapolation, but could it be also maybe some nonlinear physical constraint on something? Would it just the existence of a gap tell us something?
Yeah. So we see this also in Emily Wazinski's work. So these are two different climate variability, versions of autoencoders. And for Emily, it was a lot clearer that that was Eastern Pacific versus Central Pacific El Nino. So because she's only doing interannual variability, and if she were to only look at SST within the latent space, she gets this sort of like V-shaped latent space distribution, where it is indeed Eastern Pacific versus Central Pacific El Nino. So it could be that that gap you're seeing in the latent space is physically meaningful, and we shouldn't be interpolating or extrapolating between them, right? But then again, you go back to the question of have we just not seen those types of events?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's not that many realizations. Yeah, no, very interesting. So we're stuck in the gap in the latent space. So maybe last question, because we're sort of approaching also the end of our time. There's a question from Prakut Kansara. It wants to just get a sense of if you could talk maybe a bit about foundation models and how this might change our approach to build sort of deep learning models here compared to what you've sort of dealt with so far.
Yes, we do have some work where we saw this with C-Bottle. So the NVIDIA Foundation Climate in a Bottle approach, where they have this foundation model and you can do things with that latent space of information. But we actually didn't know about their approach with this. And we took GenCast and grabbed GenCast latent space. And what we did was we were sampling within that latent space, but doing it in a guided way where I'm able to, it's guided diffusion. I don't know how many words, I'm very excited by it. So I'm getting
Good.
ahead of
Keep
myself.
going.
But essentially we have a latent space, and maybe I'm like, okay, I know you're gonna generate this realization of an extreme event, right? And there's only so many predictions you're gonna make of that extreme event. Sure, it's an AI-based prediction system. I can do it cheaply, computationally, but I'm still not going to get every possible realization, because maybe the AI-based model inherited some biases from the model it learned from, or the data it learned from, et cetera. And maybe I'm like, I want to see whether this other thing would be possible, right? So I can take a latent space and I can train another little model that connects to it, like a little readout head, or like a machine learning model head. And what I can do is I can back propagate into the latent space with some sort of targeted thing that I want. And then I can generate that. I can continue to generate with that original backbone model what that thing is. So it's probably a terrible explanation for guided diffusion, but essentially you can take a latent space from a pre-trained large model or foundation model and use it to sample in a hopefully physically meaningful way. And so we're in the process of assessing the physical realism of these events that we're producing. But yeah, it's another way to use this original model that was trained using some supervised learning approach. At least in our case, we're taking GenCast and then sampling within that space.
Brilliant. Yeah. No, I think it's a nice example. I think we're probably at an excellent point to wrap up here. So thank you very much for a really fascinating talk. Thanks to the audience for joining. It was great. So this was the last session before this time of Christmas, and I note also AGU is going on, which makes it obviously challenging. We will actually be back on 13th of January. I just checked myself with a very nice talk by Richard Turner from Cambridge on AI weather forecasting. So we can come back. But first of all, now, thanks for joining us, Maria.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learnt something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the eShop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for good.